happy to be back working on the car, and today I'm doing front accessories, which will be water pump, alternator, and power steering pump. But before I get to that, I'm going to finish where I left off last time, which is the output for the steam port kit. I connected this end to the output on the steam vent kit, mocked it up to where it's going to enter the water pump. I put a piece of tape around it to, one, mark where I was going to cut, and two, try to hold all the pieces of braided stainless together so they don't fray apart when I cut it. I used a thin cutting wheel on my angle grinder. Worked pretty well. Now I'm going to try to get this fitting all put together. Looks like I'm going to have to separate the stainless line from the inner, I don't know if it's Teflon or whatever that inner hose lining is, and then jam this little brass piece in between the two of them, and then this will screw on top of that guy and clamp it all together. So I slid the female part of the fitting on, used a screwdriver to separate the stainless outer sheath from the inside hose, and then I just pushed it till I bottomed out the hose on the little brass fitting. And now this is just gonna get fit right inside, and then this piece is gonna thread on there, and then I'm gonna use the vise and a wrench to tighten it up, and according to the directions I tighten it until the gap is between, oh, you can't see it, 23 and 46 thousandths. And I don't have a feeler gauge, so I'm just gonna get it started, and then once I get it snug, I'll get a feeler gauge and make sure I get it tight to the correct amount. I've got a feeler gauge, and I'm looking for a gap between 23 and 46 thousandths for this fitting here. The biggest fin on this gauge is 35 thousandths, so I pulled out that one, and then the 23, and I was able to see that I have a little bit of room with the 23 thousandths, which means it's bigger than that, and I can't fit the 35 thousandths one in there, which means it must be smaller than 46 because it's even smaller than 35. So now that I have this all tight, I'm gonna go install it. Now that I've created my output for the steam port, I've connected it to the distribution block there, and here to this little plate that's gonna get sandwiched in between the water pump and the block. So the reason I did these plates is because I'm going to be using truck accessories, meaning they're spaced out 3/4 of an inch farther than the car accessories. And the reason I did that was because most of the serpentine kits out there include provisions for air conditioning, which I'm not going to have. And in addition to that, they're all very expensive. So I was able to find one that I thought looked pretty nice, didn't cost a lot of money, and all I had to do was buy alternator and power steering pump and water pump that I was able to make compatible with 3/4 inch spacing. Much like I did for these surfaces of the steam ports, I'm just going to take some parts cleaner and a rag and clean off these surfaces where the water pump is going to connect to. So in addition to cleaning off all the surfaces on the engine block, I also cleaned off all the surfaces on the water pump and on both sides of the spacers. Now I've threaded these bolts through the water pump, and I've got my first set of gaskets on there. After this, the spacer block's gonna go on, and then another gasket, and then it's gonna connect to the engine block, and I'll start torquing all these down. So I've got all the bolts just started by hand. All my gaskets and spacers are where they need to be, and now I'm taking one by one. Each bolt is getting a very light coat of anti-seize in case I need to be removing these in the future after they've been heat cycled many times. I want it to be as easy as possible. Anti-seize is applied. All the bolts are snugged up, and now they're gonna get 2 passes with a torque wrench. The first at 11 pound-feet, and then the final pass is gonna be at 22 pound-feet of torque. Now that I've got the water pump installed, I'm going to install a heater core bypass hose. Now the reason I'm doing this is just to save time on the initial build and install of the motor, because ultimately I do plan on having a heater core hooked up and having a fan and vent system inside the car. But for the initial build, I want to worry about the pieces that are more important to the actual functionality of the car. And just like that, with 2 little hose clamps, it's done. Now I'm going to work on the alternator hardware and getting the alternator hooked up. And it looks like there's a bunch of little parts to sift through and a bunch of spacers and things to figure out. So I think I'm just going to do that on my own and then make a video afterwards describing how I did it. Okay, I got the alternator mounted and it was not too bad after all. The first thing I had to do was remove these 2 bolts from the water pump that I just put in so that this bracket that holds the turnbuckle could get mounted. It included longer bolts to make up for this amount of space and all the spacers and washers and brackets. And then all I had to do was bolt this little triangular bracket to the head and then use these spacers and the bolts provided, and that's it. Now I'm gonna move on to the power steering pump. The power steering pump bracket was pretty painless as well. Pretty much all it was this plate that got bolted onto the head. A single bolt went from that plate into the back of the power steering pump, and then everything else was bolted on from the front here. A couple spacers, couple bolts, and then the 4 bolts that go right into the front of the pump.